supports that matter most. So all of this is looking at how do we move collectively as one strong sector, as a big volunteer and as a big workforce, to address the priorities that are really holding the Arts Ottawa community down and back. And we think about our role as Arts Ottawa as making sure that the environment and the soils really well so that the arts community can thrive. And what we see are a lot of actions that happen is we see a lot of piloting, we see a lot of project grants, we see a lot of precarity. That means that we're constantly in this garden, this ecosystem, planting individual annual flowers, which are fine, but not all those annual flowers are self-seeding. Not all of those annual flowers are going to like support the ecosystem around it. So how can we get to a point where we're planting some self-seeding wildflowers? How are we getting to the point where we're planting some perennial and some evergreens? And how can we get to a place where we're deepening our roots in the community and planting some actual fruit trees that are going to kind of nourish us in the future? This is the work that we're focusing on. And this is where I think some of the discussions around community wealth building are going to help us get there. So here's the civic infrastructure lens that we're working with. And this is how we think about the arts, is that it's not a nice to have on the side. This is what we know. I think it's the values that we share. We know that the arts are essential to everyday life. They're an essential part of building a vibrant city, of the well-being of our population, of building our belonging. And so this is the civic infrastructure we've divided into 3 different streams. And these are the conditions that are making our cultural work possible. So the first is around physical infrastructure. So how do we have clear pathways to engage with physical spaces along with practical guidance on civic systems? So how do we make sure that we have the rehearsal studio spaces, the creation spaces, the presentation spaces, the actual milieu that we need to be able to make our work and connect with the people? The social infrastructure is really, do we have the data and the storytelling to demonstrate our social impact? Do we know, is our ecosystem visible? Do we know what we have and where are our data gaps? And it comes here too today where we're talking about our economic infrastructure. So the effective coordination, shared messaging that favor arts and culture and local economic development, along with the models that support fair work, ownership, equity, and long-term sustainability. Right, we talk a lot about there isn't fair work for artists. We talk a lot about we don't have decision-making in spaces. We talk a lot about how we feel outside of the systems that support us. And maybe community wealth building is a way to build some shared language and to make some of the kind of policy and system change that we want to see that can get us out of this precarity, scarcity mindset into a place of more of stability and abundance. And I'll bring another piece, and it's a resource we'll share out when we share out the slide with everybody. At the Canadian Urban Institute held a City to City Summit in Ottawa in December. And one of the keynotes was Zita Cobb. And so she is the founder of the Fogo Inn on Fogo Island, which is a small island across Newfoundland. I've never been there, but I hear it's really lovely. And they've launched a new organization called the Shorefast Institute. And so she's talking a little bit about how their approach to place-based community economic development. And she put her framing of why economic development is important in a really lovely way. She said, I only care about the economy because the economy is what's holding up all the other things that I love, and all the people that I love. And that's such a beautiful way to think about how we in the arts can be approaching economic development. This kind of frames out the work, the very interconnected work that Arts Ottawa is trying to do. And it's really work that we can only do collectively. So this is, what this learning lab is about. And I'll throw it to Leah in a minute, who will introduce our speakers and run us through the rest of the day. I'll sit quietly back. But it's this is something that, we want to learn more about as an Arts Ottawa staff. It's like, is this a framework? Is this a shared language? But like we did in our merger process, we don't want to learn alone. We don't want to build a shared language that only we as staff and our, board and community leadership use. We want to build a shared language and shared skills that we as a collective community can use. And we include our collective community as not only artists and arts workers, and arts practitioners and audiences, but also the other social services and other economic development services that are also working in the space. How can we collectively move some priorities and some shared visions of the future together? So that brings us to today. It's a big vision. So like everything is all connected, it's all one big ecosystem. And with that, I'll pass it to Leah, who we're so grateful to be working with.
Thank you. Okay, so Cassandra has set us up so beautifully with the sort of high level. I'm going to scale us into what we're meant to be talking about today. But for those of you who weren't able to join us for the launch in March, it's worth taking just a minute to talk through what do we mean by community wealth building, and what do we specifically as a community in arts and culture practice space mean when we say community wealth building, which is evolving as we engage with you and as we engage with these concepts. But we've set up this series to explore each pillar. So I just want to quickly sort of touch on where did we start with our understanding of this framework, and then where are we headed over the next several months as we unpack the different elements of this framework. And as Cassandra said, it's exploratory. It's giving us potentially shared language with other sectors with which we may want to partner to increase our impact, to be more present in decision making. And so we're wanting to wrestle out these components, these models, and this language in particular, so that we can show up with proficiency and be effective in our impact. So community wealth building as a model is sort of a subversion of the traditional economic development model, which assumes a trickle-down effect, which we in the arts and culture industry know doesn't necessarily occur, at least not the ways in which we would like to see them occur, where there's an empowerment at our sort of practice level. So community wealth building is a people-centered approach to economic development that focuses really on building and potentially retaining what we have and recirculating or redistributing wealth that exists or that could exist in local systems to create a more resilient and inclusive local economy. So really working against that precarity piece that Cassandra was talking about. And so our experts at the launch, we streamed in some folks from Scotland who are applying this framework specifically for arts and culture, and have developed out a toolkit, which I highly recommend that you take a look at. And then we also spoke to United Way and to local legal experts about the application of community wealth building more broadly. And so for today, we're focusing in on this first pillar of pluralistic ownership. And I've intentionally brought in not just the arts and culture perspective. So my background is in that bridging, and that bridging role is so key between housing and arts and culture. And so we're going to hear from the Community Land Trust, so I was an expert in community land trusts as a potential model that we could adopt within the arts and culture space. We're going to hear about a cooperative artist project, and then we're going to wrestle out asset-based community development and what that means for us and applying that approach as we build out potential new businesses within this model. So Mike, as I mentioned, works for the Ottawa Community Land Trust, guiding the organization's initial housing acquisitions, capital growth, partnership development, and community engagement. But over the last 20 years, he's really been invested in and digging into various policy research and community development roles that promote housing security and social inclusion. Chris, and there's so much more, but I'll let you sort of take it from there, Mike. Chris is the founder and principal of Ground Force Digital, as well as, interestingly, the Chief Technology Officer at the Art Canada Institute. And he has a breadth of experience helping social impact organizations navigate digital transformation. We've invited him here today because he was the director and product lead for Fineline, which was a special project at OCAD University funded through the Government of Canada's Future Skills Centre. And it was set out to build an online art marketplace. And so he's going to tell us a little bit more about that experience, what they learned from that, and share some materials and templates and things from that so that we can pick it up and potentially carry it forward. And then Amanda, who's hiding at the back, is a postdoctoral fellow in community engaged digital humanities at Carleton, and the lead of StudioDH. And they do really interesting work working with students, researchers, and community organizations to design participatory projects, which is sort of what we'll be testing after the presentation and roundtable component of today. And she's going to share a little bit more about her methodology and actually give you a live experience of it once we're done with our sort of front of the room pieces. So I won't say much more about what you do because they'll get to experience it in real time. So thank you to the three of you for being here. Let's dive in.
Good morning, everyone. And so thanks for the introduction and invitation. Really getting inspired and really loving kind of the energy that's here. So I like, and I'm glad that Leah mentioned that, like, my presentation in particular, I do feel like comes from outside of the world of arts and culture. I think that there are some really strong bridges that we can make, but maybe it's also fair to think of what I'm bringing as kind of like a case study of how community wealth building, I think, is trying to be advanced in admittedly another sector, or starting from another sector. I think one that can be expansive bridge over. But so I really will be talking more about the affordable housing space in Ottawa and how we're looking at trying to leverage community wealth building as an approach to help preserve and expand affordable housing. So this, I start with this because this really is kind of the impetus of what brought us together as the Land Trust. And so the Land Trust, I'll mention in a minute a little bit more about how we're structured, but we're turning 5 this year, so it's still a relatively new, young organization. I'm not sure how long I can say that, but federally incorporated in 2021. And while I wasn't around in the very first days, I think that the origin story comes from there's a couple of threads to that origin story, but the one big one is folks who are working in the affordable housing space in Ottawa. And when I say that, when I'm thinking about our nonprofit and cooperative housing organizations, operators, supportive housing would be a part of that. There was a recognition that absolutely we don't have enough affordable housing in Ottawa. We're not building enough, but we're also losing a lot of what we have. And a lot of what we have, especially in the private market, that has over many years been and become affordable through things like rent control and tenancies that have stayed in long terms, those units were being lost. And so in fact, between 2011 and 2021, the stats here in the National Capital Region show that 30,000 rental homes, apartments, that had been available for $1,000 or less per month were lost. And it wasn't just through demolitions, but it was also, when a building would sell, a financialized actor would buy that. The whole incentive there was, uplift of the rents. You saw things like rent evictions. You also, just because we have vacancy, like there's rent decontrol between tenancies. Rent 1 month would be $800, and when a new tenant comes in, that might be $1,200 or $1,400 or $1,500. And so we saw this massive loss of affordable units. And while we had operators and groups that wanted to build more affordable housing, the resources for that were insufficient. And in fact, for every 1 new unit that was built, we lost 31 of these on the backside. And so I guess the conversation within the housing sector in that time was, what can we do to try to intervene in that space? Acquisition, so when that 12-unit building or the 50-unit building or the threeplex is for sale, rather than letting it go to a financialized actor, whether that's a real estate investment trust or a pension fund or another investor collaborative, is it possible for a nonprofit, a non-market group to actually acquire that, preserve those units, and then remove the property from the speculative market and place it under community ownership or community stewardship? The challenge there is that, for an organization to do that, you're taking on significant debt. You might not have the desire to do that. You might not have the skill set or the competencies for long-term kind of asset management. And so the conversation shifted towards creating a new entity that would have more of a focus, a laser focus on doing that, on raising the capital to do that, on building the sort of capacity for that long-term kind of asset ownership. The idea had from the beginning been not to replicate what existing organizations are doing. And so I'll talk a little bit about that, but I want to mention it now as well. When we try to buy a building, and when we buy a building, our goal is not to operate it for the long term, because we have those amazing nonprofit, cooperative, supportive housing organizations that are doing that. They know their clientele, they know their tenants, they know the services that they need. So our desire is to grow a portfolio that we can make available to those organizations that want to grow, that have wait lists, that have the expertise to do what they do, and provide them with more buildings to do the great work that they're doing. And so it's really, we've always had a very, I think, clear focus on trying to stay in a very particular lane. So the Land Trust was really created to kind of fill that gap on a citywide basis. So in one slide, trying to describe who we are, as I mentioned, we were founded in 2021, federally incorporated as a nonprofit. That was intentional, I say federally, because I think that there are folks who do, I think we see ourselves as a land trust for the National Capital Region, and we are interested in preserving affordability in Gatineau as well. We are fueled by community, so we are a member-led organization. Jazz Winter, who's here this morning, is one of our board. We're in that way, we're a traditional nonprofit. I'll come to another definition of a community land trust on the next slide, I think. Really, what are we trying to do? We're trying to grow resources to acquire buildings. And where those rents are modestly affordable, we want to keep that affordability. We are also interested in securing land. If we can, secure land and in the same way remove it from that speculative market and make it available for future development of affordable housing, that would be amazing. Our focus, I think, for the first few years has been more around the acquisition of buildings. And that's in part, the business model. We want to become self-sustaining. We have benefited from government grants, especially on our operations to get started. From CMHC, the Community Housing Transformation Center, the recovery fund from ESDC and a few of those. But over the long term, we want to establish a portfolio that will pay for our work, our operations as well. And so our first focus has been, buying properties where there's revenue, and that's been a part of our business model. I think we are having more and more conversations about, there's a piece of land there, and we know that organization would like to grow and build something there. So could we become the steward of that parcel of land? And then, like I said, it's not really to grow a new organization that would compete with existing ones, but how do we help scale the existing community housing sector and achieve collective impact? So our focus, raise the capital, acquire the buildings, manage those assets over the long term, but partner with, by that, ideally lease our buildings to organizations that may operate them on a day-to-day basis and have the clientele for them. And in so doing, I think the goal is to benefit from economies of scale, right? So if you imagine at a very simplistic level, 10 small organizations, each working to acquire their buildings, they might each have a building that's worth $1 million or $2 million. They have fairly limited leverage if they want to grow from there. So I think one of the sort of simplistic ways of thinking of the land trust is if the land trust owned those 10 buildings, suddenly we have a balance sheet of 10 or 20 million. If we see another property that's for sale, we have much better leverage to get a mortgage or to get a loan. And our view is that we can lease those buildings to those partner organizations to do exactly what they want to do and would have done if they owned the building, remove them from the stress often of building ownership. So there's more to it than that. I don't mean to be totally crude, but from a business model, I guess that's a little bit about why we were created. So this, I'm not going to read this slide, but I think there is often a mystery around community land trust of, is it a particular legal structure? Is it a legal incorporation? And quite honestly, most of us, in Canada at least, are structured as nonprofits. There are a few that are operated as charities as well. We are not a charity. We don't have charitable status. Can talk more about that. But and so, I think what this slide does is really nicely tell the story of why we choose that name, Community Land Trust. I also love the very simple definition that a colleague uses of, a CLT is really an organization that's created and trusted by community to hold land and to hold land that maximizes community benefit. And that's really what we're doing. And I think I'd be remiss, I think, not to say that our first focus has been affordable housing. A CLT is really about stewardship of land that maximizes community benefit, and it could be used for housing. It could be used for affordable commercial spaces. It could be used for nonprofit space. There's gardening spaces and food security and all these various ways in which land can benefit community. And absolutely, we are open to leaning into some of those other spaces as well. So already the Kensington Market CLT, by nature of Kensington Market's neighborhood fabric, some of the housing that they bought has commercial spaces on the bottom, and so they're offering affordable commercial spaces. The Chinatown Land Trust or the Little Jamaica Land Trust in Toronto are also about cultural preservation. And I think that the OCLT is very interested in moving to that as well. And so I just mentioned that as a possible bridge between our work and what I think a lot of you think there as well. I'm watching the time, which is running it over. So I guess that the challenge for us when we started is how are you going to remove land from the speculative market if we didn't, we weren't created with an endowment, we weren't created with a significant budget to start. And so our hypothesis from day one was we're going to have to blend capital from different sources to do this work. And this is not a mystery. When we buy a building, we're probably eligible for a mortgage of some kind. When we buy buildings where the rents are affordable, especially deeply affordable, the revenue that we have as the owner is going to be limited. So our mortgage eligibility will be limited. And so we look to some kind of non-repayable capital would be great, because the more free money means we don't have to pay that back or service that debt over the long term. So we are interested in public funding and philanthropy, but I would say that both of those are fairly limited for us, because within the Ottawa area, there really isn't funding for this kind of acquisition work. You do have that in the city of Toronto, you have that in BC, and the federal government has announced they're creating a fund to do this. It hasn't rolled out yet. So that's limited, but we have tapped it a little bit because some of our purchases have been seen as pilots. So even the city has come on board, which is really lovely. We are not a charity, so that limits the incentive for folks to make philanthropic contributions to us. Having said that, our first purchase was enabled with a significant gift from someone who didn't need the tax receipt or the receipt for tax purposes. And we are exploring partnerships there's a new organization called Partners for Affordable Housing. It is like a national charity raising philanthropic capital to make available for groups like us. So, very much see that as part of a capital stack that might lead to any of our acquisitions. But then finally, and I'll spend a few minutes talking about that, is how do we lean into social finance or community investment? And I guess, I've talked a little bit about our business model as being premised upon sector collaboration. And I think that's one way in which we see, like, how do we leverage, that organization's expertise in delivering services, hopefully over time our expertise in purchase and asset management. So collaboration at that level. But I think what we're also really trying to do is bring community, folks, like everyone in this room, organizations, nonprofits, small businesses, bring them into this work of creating new housing solutions here in Ottawa. And that's really where we look to community finance or social finance. So just by way of kind of as an illustration, our first purchase was in the fall of 2023. We saw the 6-unit apartment building for sale. This was on the market. It was listed on MLS like anything else. And we did have a sense of another land trust in Toronto that had made a purchase using a particular financial model that they had worked out with a lender called Van City Community Investment Bank, wholly owned by Van City Credit Union. So a really fantastic impact first lender, I would say. And they developed this way for us to, put our offer on the table, ensure that at closing we would have the funds, but the funds likely through sort of a 12 or 24 month kind of credit facility or a loan. We knew we had, Councillor Leeper was making a contribution to us, so there was that sort of pilot acquisition support. We had that gift, which was really lovely. We got the line of credit from the bank. And then we said, we're going to pay off the rest of the line of credit that we have with community bonds. And so we had a plan to the following spring launch the sale of community bonds. Now, over the long term for that property is to have a conventional mortgage, because then the bonds that we use to secure that can be used for other purchases. So just a really quick 101 on community bonds. Community bonds are really, they're kind of structured like a GIC. It's really a term-defined loan that individuals make, in this case to the OCLT. And that's to help us pool resources within the community that might otherwise just be invested elsewhere. And often, I don't think we know what impact those investments are having, or we know that those impacts are not necessarily positive. So we're trying to encourage folks to, leave their money or some of their money here in the community. And then we can use that. We can pool that to, close on a deal and pay our interest to folks in the community as well, right? So it's really a way of trying to recirculate as much capital as we can here within the community. And we call those bonds Housing Forever bonds. And what we're trying to do is grow a community-fueled acquisition fund. And so, I won't go through this entire model in detail either, but, we sell you a bond, somebody invests $5,000 with us. For the 3 or the 5 or the 7 years that we have that capital, we can use it to make these purchases, like I'm saying. When we do secure a traditional mortgage on a property, or over time, as we refinance the properties and they grow in value, those community bonds that had been used can come back to our fund. And if your 5-year term is up, you get your money back, or we can use it to purchase another property. And so we're trying to establish this evolving fund using the capital that's in the community. So these are not philanthropic gifts that folks are making. These are not donations. They're really loans. And so, the community story that we're trying to tell is, yes, we have a problem. We're in a housing crisis. We're losing hundreds of units every year. We think that preservation of those units is one part of the solution. And we believe that by working together, we as a community can do things that we hadn't necessarily imagined yesterday. And that's kind of the value proposition for this campaign. So we launched these campaigns. This is May of 2024 at Arlington 5, lovely coffee shop downtown. On the day that we launched, so we wanted to raise 1.7 million. We needed to pay off that line of credit on the first purchase. We wanted to grow. And already on the first day, we had 3 nonprofit organizations. One was a housing co-op, one was the United Way, and one was the Lower Town Community Resource Center. Each of these organizations had reserves, and they said, well, why don't we invest some of those reserves in the community? Later, the Community Health Center in Centertown came on board. They have a mandate and a mission to preserve the health and well-being of folks in the community. They said, we do that through our programs. Why not do that through our reserve funds as well? And so we're really trying to leverage this idea not leverage, we were trying to build this idea of leveraging the community wealth for this benefit. And I know I'm watching my time, I'm running out, so I'll try to move quickly. But I think, what I feel was significant through the campaign was that even in the sort of media coverage that we did start to generate, it wasn't so much about, oh, we're building this new organization, it's the Land Trust, but we are trying to create new pathways for folks to work together and contribute to housing solutions. And I think that was exciting, exciting to see. The campaign was, I think, the community responded in really lovely ways, and we were able to acquire a 10-unit building that summer in Vanier. Just to give you a sense, so we ended up raising 3 million. We adjusted our model because of the interest and demand. And so we raised 3 million. And that came from 140 different investments, 133 folks, so 7 people invested in 2 different classes. But this just gives you a sense of, well over 100 of those investments were around 1 or 5,000. But like some of those nonprofits, and there were a couple of small businesses and a family foundation that invested more than that, together, pooled into $3 million for us. And that, like I said, came from nonprofits, it came from foundations, local businesses. And we launched a new campaign last fall. And we're really trying to lean into this way of, and we've had meetings in the past couple of months with other nonprofits that want to invest in businesses to, again, really build out that idea. I want to come to a closing slide, so I'll just very quickly. So we did, we closed that campaign at the end of 2024. We learned of another organization, the CCOC, fantastic operator in the downtown area. Well, I shouldn't say that. They have properties across the city. Their roots are in the Centertown area. They also wanted to raise capital to support the redevelopment of new housing. And so we launched a joint campaign last September, together trying to raise capital in the capital. I'm going to move a little bit quickly through this. This just gives you a sense of like right now, so if you go to housingforeverbonds.ca, you'll see these are the kinds of terms that are available if folks want to invest. And again, it's framed as an investment in the community. Folks might have differing views on these rates. I think the financial rates of return, we argue, are comparable to a lot of GICs, but it really is those social returns on top of this that help prevent displacement of folks, help expand the affordable housing, help meet our SDGs, and so on. And that's really what we're trying to offer. We are, I think that there's momentum now. We're building a model. We currently have offers on 2 different properties, a 31-unit building, and I will say that none of our purchases have been possible without some degree of community investment. What I think is really exciting about this 31-unit building is, and we have now waived our financing conditions, so we're in the final weeks of due diligence. There is no public capital going into this, and there is no philanthropic capital going into this. This is simply being done through, what the lender is offering us and what the community members have brought forward. So that wouldn't have been possible if community investment wasn't part of the mix. And then on this last one that I wanted to mention, this is a smaller property that we're trying to close on right now. This is one that really, I think, demonstrates that kind of community collaboration that we're trying to lean into even more, right? So this is currently owned by a nonprofit, Ottawa Salis. They are building elsewhere in the city and are selling their smaller properties to raise equity to support their development. So they're trying to grow. We want to buy that to keep it under non-market community stewardship. And we're working towards an agreement with Matthew House, which serves refugees and asylum claimants in Ottawa, to lease that building from us. So now, if refugees and asylum claimants are living in that, we know that their incomes are capped, and so the rent revenue is more limited. So this is one where we need, some philanthropic, some non-repayable capital. So we're trying to market that right now within the philanthropic community. So the sort of capital mix on each one will vary, but I think, and we'll probably have more of a discussion around this, at the end of the day, like these purchases, each deal needs to be financially viable. We cannot, especially now that we have community investors in this mix, we can't risk their investments that they're making with us and then trust that they're with us. So I think just as a last slide, I focus on kind of the acquisition piece, but I think what the Land Trust at a higher level is trying to do is create this entity that is there to explore ways of working together to grow and preserve the affordable housing that we have in the city. And so, we're partnering with a number of additional service providers. I mentioned the deal that we're working on with Matthew House. There are others that would like to grow and are asking us about whether we can make building purchases on their behalf. There's a growing interest, as I'm sure there is in every sector, and in fact, Arts Ottawa is the result of a recent kind of coming together of different organizations. But I think within the housing space, we also see that. I think there's sometimes a concern in those conversations that organizations will lose their identity and their own history. The Land Trust offers an interesting kind of take on that, where we can actually acquire a building and then lease it back to that organization so that they can continue to operate in the same way. So we're having conversations with some housing co-ops in particular that might be interested in that. Homes as legacy gifts. I think there are different models that we're looking at right now to grow, but I will leave it there and look forward to conversation and other things.
Thanks. Awesome. I'm sure your wheels are turning and there's so much to dig into there, but I'm going to hand things off to Chris. We're going to give him a minute and then we'll get our panelists together to chat.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for the invitation, and I'm really excited to be speaking with you today. and to be learning about Arts Ottawa and the work that that's happening with this this series. So I've thanks for the introduction, Leah, and I'll just say that I'm based here in Ottawa now. I during the Fineline project was based in Toronto, but I'm happy to have moved to Ottawa in late 2022. Yeah, so this is a great introduction to this work that you're doing. And from 2022 to 2024, I was the lead facilitator of a project called Fineline at OCAD University. It was an initiative funded by the Canadian government, Future Skills Grant, the Canadian government, and it was set up to test whether a university could incubate a cooperative that was owned as a platform cooperative that was owned by artist entrepreneurs. Not everybody in the community would use the term, as we heard earlier. Definitely, it's interesting, a lot of the challenges that you're describing about even use of language and how we define the work certainly came up on this project. So I'm here to share sort of what was built, what worked, what didn't work, importantly, and what takeaways there might be from the experience in relation to the conversation about community wealth building that we're having today. Okay, so I mean, I don't need to tell this room, you know, what that artists and artists that are working to run their own businesses face significant economic precarity. It was exacerbated during COVID, and as you can see on the slide here, in OCAD's original presentation and pitch to the Future Skills Center, they found that 86% of OCAD graduates, as they said, pursued entrepreneurship. You know, again, I actually came on midway through the project, so I don't actually 100% know what pursuing entrepreneurship exactly means, but I think we dabbled with starting a business, maybe did something on the side. I mean, a lot of folks are freelancing and whatnot. And so I think it's really important here that almost 60% of those that are pursuing entrepreneurship are earning less than half their income from art. And these are, you know, so it's a really precarious situation. And as I said, COVID was intensifying all of that. So this project really grew up, and the pitch was made in 2020. And the idea that existing platforms, whether it's Etsy or others, are extractive in nature, and that vendors on those platforms are really at the whims of the rates that are charged, which can sometimes be well over 40% or more, especially if it's ad supported and whatnot sales. So it's not only that the rates are high, it's also that there's a lack of sort of agency or control over what those rates are, and uncertainty, right? And adds to the stress. So artists lack also the sort of sector-specific business training. They were finding in OCAD, given the high percentage of graduates that are going on to pursue their own business ventures and whatnot, sometimes in their academic setting, there aren't necessarily the skills, whether it's finance or otherwise, and that there was potentially a need for that type of training, which led to this idea of Fineline. So in 2021, the OCAD made a successful case to the Future Skills Center. They received $1.7 million, and it was matched with a $700,000 commitment in kind from the university. And it had a bold mission. The mission was to build an online marketplace and cooperative where creatives could sell their work while developing the skills to thrive in a just economy. The project was originally called Craft, and it was later rebranded Fineline. So the Fineline model was designed as a platform cooperative, and really the term platform cooperative just means that there's one of the shared assets is a technology platform, and you can go a bit deeper than that, but legally the cooperative is no different than any other co-op. It was developed with the support of the Ontario Co-op Association, sort of advising the team in terms of setting up the incorporated not-for-profit entity, but a platform co-op isn't different than other types of co-ops in that from a legal perspective. The model had three pillars: the Learning Studio, and the Learning Studio was peer-to-peer workshops. Actually, the peer-to-peer workshops were originally pitched, but then through that, and I'll talk a bit more about the Business Accelerator program, but it was a signature sort of 6-week entrepreneurial skills cohort-based program that involved in-person learning. That was the first pillar. The second pillar was the cooperative development. So in incubation of a cooperative, so giving artists co-ownership and a direct say in the governance. And again, with the support of the Ontario Co-op Association that was launched, the idea certainly was to incubate and to have that co-op then be sustaining. We'll get into that. And then finally, a marketplace at Fineline.art. The pitch there was, for artists to be able to sell directly to buyers and to have, curated collections, and specifically in this case, OCAD University and its alumni group was a core audience, but this project was open beyond just alumni or students of OCAD University. So the intended cycle here was that the learning builds community, community feeds the co-op and marketplace, and the marketplace would generate revenue and reinvest that revenue in learning. That was the intent. A couple of milestones here. Some of the project milestones, from the original grant in 2020 to the artist discovery and co-creation workshops. There's a lot of input, a lot of need to really unpack this project, and I don't have time to get into all the nuance there. It was a very complex and really fruitful conversation. I think sort of mirrored some of the, what people are grappling with and bringing themselves to these conversations. It's very real, and I think one of the things was they needed somebody to come in and help facilitate a process following those consultations to actually then help facilitate the process moving forward, which is when I came into the project. And that work happened between 2021 to 2022, and then the launch of the learning programs and marketplace and the founding of the co-op happened in 2022, 2023. And I think that these slides, will they be circulated afterwards?
We can share them out,
So yeah, happy to do that. I know there's a bunch I'm not gonna be able to touch on each of these. So how it worked and what worked. In reflecting on the different pillars of the program, the learning programs in particular, and especially the cohort-based Business Accelerator program was a clear standout. There were 3 cohorts of 15 to 20 artists, so 46 total accelerator graduates. In the individual learning programs, there was a broader group, 378. There was a lot of positive feedback. The cohort design was done in collaboration with Highwire Collective. It was combining the technical business skills, like things like pricing, art, financial sustainability, brand identity, with more reflective, collaborative, peer-to-peer learning. And the approach was importantly that Highwire Collective brought the feminist and post-growth lens, which was really important to meet artists where they were at, and that this isn't about just doing business like everybody else does business, that's not going to get us where we want to get to as this cooperative. That it's really important to take a different lens on what you mean by entrepreneurship, what you mean by economic development, what you mean by the values that underpin this. And I think that was really important, and it's why, and it's a big part of what came out of this. So 97% of the participants felt that their skills were improved. 91% would recommend it. I think, frankly, all of these numbers are a little hard to grasp. It really comes to, or it comes back to the relationships that were created that stood out, and people who were, participants in this program. People like Sarah, who, I was telling Leah that it was emotional to put together and reflect on this project because it's such a meaningful community, and it was a real sort of highlight of my career to be able to work on this project with people like Sarah and see what they put in, but also got out of the project. So, okay, moving along. One of the key insights looking back on Fineline was that all 7 co-op directors and all of the first directors, which is just the group that initially founds the co-op, came directly from the accelerator program. They were either participants or there was Vandana was one of the coaches. And so that's the group on the right-hand side, I guess, if you're looking at the screen, of the 7 first directors. And you can see how that learning the sort of pathway to becoming director really flowed through the 46 folks that participated in the cohort-based program. So the key insight, really looking back, is that the importance of that cohort-based program, and that it really created the incentive and community and buy-in to actually take it to the next level and join and become a leader of the founding the co-op. Importantly, it was. So there was a lot that worked and a lot that worked and a lot that was taken away by the participants. But in terms of the overall mission and vision of Fineline, there were things that were hard. So what was hard? The model was groundbreaking. It also surfaced real sort of structural challenges in terms of the original vision. And I think hopefully, again, we don't just reflect on this to feel negative about it. It's about informing future collective ownership initiatives, and it's really exciting, especially when it's in the arts. So let's talk about some of these things that were hard. So one of the things that was hard, really, the capacity and sort of incentive gap. The artists who were the most well suited to be on the board, or at least that were bought into the project and wanted to be on the board, were the same people that were managing the precarity of that I described earlier, and the people looking at piecing together multiple income streams just to get by. And the nonprofit co-op board, those roles were necessarily unpaid, but the government's demands were substantial. I should say that absolutely it was critical. All of the staff and contractor roles were paid to do the work, but when it came to the not-for-profit co-op board, those board members couldn't be paid to do that work. So that's a challenge. Fundamentally, co-ops work best when they're founded by people that have a direct personal stake and the founder drive. The co-op was initiated in this case by the university, and it sought its members. So that's really fundamentally different dynamic. The founding sort of energy and what it takes to actually get something like this going and go out and make the pitches to those that could have, say, invested dollars to do the type of marketing and whatnot that would be needed to grow the marketplace. That was a lot to ask of these folks who got involved in the project. Secondly, incubating a grassroots organization or co-op inside an institution was experimental, and there were challenges. The university operates on different timelines. It had grant reporting cycles, so it's not just within university, it's also that it was sort of a significant amount of money one time from the federal government that had a lot of reporting timelines and deadlines associated with it that I think all of us who have, we understand you have to get certain things. This is public dollars and there's accountability, but it was interesting. It sometimes wasn't consistent with the co-op needs, which really were moving at more of a community pace, right? An organic and learning pace. So there was sometimes tension, and the 2.5 year grant timeline, and actually that was extended a bit. It was originally 2 years, was ambitious, and simultaneously building a marketplace, iterating on learning programs, and incubating a co-op was a huge amount to undertake in that period of time. Thirdly, when it comes to the marketplace, competing platforms, are like Etsy and others. They are extractive, but they also have the network effects and the real sort of marketing budget to have move product, right? Like that for this marketplace, got out of the gate. I think there was a lot of work done on sort of positioning and branding and whatnot, but there was never the marketing dollars to make the sort of splash and raise awareness to really start the flywheel, so to speak, I guess to use a term, to basically start a virtuous cycle that could bring in buyers that would then justify and attract more artists. So that didn't take off, and membership fees and the key here is it's not just the marketplace didn't take off, the model really depended on there being spin-off revenue to fund the co-op, right? So membership fees were never going to be the sort of sustaining operations from this community. Even $5 or $10 is a lot for a lot of the artists that would have been involved in the project, especially for a startup project. So, that's what was, those are the kinds of things that were hard, and I don't think the artists and the organizational reps see these as failures in the sense that there was a lot of real value for the participants of the program, but they are learnings, and we want to be frank about them so that they can inform future collective ownership models, like we're doing today, which is sort of the impact. Again, I'm happy to share the more detailed impact report and any of the other materials if that would be of interest to anyone in the room. I'll talk about that more in a second. So in terms of looking forward, a few thoughts, because I wanted to be, I didn't want to just say, well, that didn't work. So, but a couple takeaways. So things that anyone working on a model like this might want to consider. I think that although there was a lot of consultation and like information gathering, the co-op was not founded at the outset. And I think actually that probably there was a lot of focus on information gathering and then on the marketplace launch, whereas we needed to, and it would have been beneficial to flip that and have the co-op really lead from the beginning. It might have been messier. It probably would have taken a lot more time, but it might have been, I think it would have been more sustainable. Especially though, that's challenging at the university because they're wired to run the learning programs. So right, the learning programs were getting out of the gate pretty quickly, but those weren't being run by the co-op. And it would have been great, I think, to have created a space where those participants in the learning programs, the co-op, or not necessarily formed yet, but those folks that wanted to take leadership to start the co-op could have taken a bigger hand in running the learning programs and then also overseeing the marketplace, rather than the flip side, which really was that the participants in the learning programs went and started the co-op. Second, the founder equity and incentive, and there's no easy answers here. I honestly, this is not simplistic. I don't know the answer. I'm just saying it probably is something that there does need to be for some of the founders to have ways to compensate them for what they're doing. For those that are willing to take the risk to actually get something like this started off the ground. There are some interesting models in Vancouver. We've worked with some folks that did take more of a social venture approach and had some equity stake in a marketplace that has similarities to this and ended up being sold to another group. So that's always the issue. If you have the sort of equity and then it gets sold, and does that organization, what values does it have? So lots to unpack there, but it's something that probably warranted a bit more discussion. It was very difficult to have that conversation when you're talking about getting money from the federal government and when you're talking about housing at a public institution like a university. Thirdly, technology landscape is shifting. So this is actually something huge that's happened. And I know the complexity of AI, especially in the arts sector. So again, this is not about it being a simplistic answer, but one of the big barriers to the artists actually running the platform cooperative was that none of them, at least the people that were involved in the board level, had deep technical skills to actually be involved in building the marketplace. And one of the hallmarks of a successful platform cooperative, often there's at least one of the founders who is a coder or who's building the actual underlying systems and not reliant on third-party consultants or those that are outside of the community of the co-op. So now it's interesting. We're not quite there yet, but I think that they're actually that some of the probably heard whether it's vibe coding or being able to build with plain language prompts, software. We're not there yet, but in the coming years, it may give more power to those that don't necessarily have a development background to actually start their own platform cooperatives. Again, I don't suggest that that's an easy thing, but it is something that's different than what we were dealing with back in 2022 before ChatGPT, just before ChatGPT came out. And I think, hope that some of this is helpful in terms of informing today's conversation. I'll just say that I am happy to, and I think it's really happy to share resources. Although Fineline, the marketplace ended up essentially getting rolled into OCAD Shop, the co-op. It persisted for a couple of years. I think it's probably still an entity, but again, because of the funding challenges and whatnot, it's not going concern, I don't think, any longer. It's not still offering programs. But we'd be very happy to share. There was a lot of work done, a lot of here that we could share. So first of all, co-op formation and process and documentation. We worked with the Ontario Co-op Association, so happy to share that. The marketing development approach and brand positioning blueprint. So there's a lot to share there about how it came up with Fineline and positioning in the marketplace. I think there was a lot of good work done there. Future Skills Center project reports and learning evaluations, happy to share those. And there's an impact brief. So again, just reach out to me. I will have to run it by the team at OCAD, but I don't see any issue with sharing those. And I just want to end on, I want to say, okay, this is a little bit, it's still within the OCAD sphere, but this is another thing that's coming up that I'm projects that I've been working on. I work on the democratic engagement space as well, and interesting from a collective action perspective. We're going to be gathering at the Global Center for Pluralism to talk about sort of pace and principles, and how we're in this moment where many of us are facing a lot of challenges, and the country is making these big decisions about where to head, how to keep up. So I mentioned this. This is a collaboration with OCAD University as well. Again, Democracy Exchange, which has been around for a decade. But if you're interested in attending, you can scan there or follow up, and I'll send you the information. That's for me.
Amazing.